My parents promised me their whole lives that I would inherit the family business. At the last minute, they signed everything over to my irresponsible brother, shattering all my expectations. I devised a plan to get my way, and what happened next was pure revenge. Hi, this is Arena of Revenge. Here you'll find exciting stories with gripping plots and vengeance. Follow us. All my life, I grew up thinking that the family business my parents built from scratch when I was still a child would one day be mine. I watched them dedicate themselves to their work, often sacrificing their personal lives for the sake of our small hotel empire in the Chicago suburbs. Every evening, I listened to them talk about expansion plans, new acquisitions, and ideas that would take our brand national. My parents always repeated that I was their pride, that the business would be mine when the time came, that they trusted me completely and would never disappoint. I studied economics at university, worked for the company since my teens, understood financial statements, and managed small projects to prepare for the legacy that seemed natural and inevitable to me. My brother, 4 years younger, was the complete opposite. He never liked to work. He was more interested in parties, quick money, and the easy life. My parents always seemed to turn a blind eye to his irresponsibility, and I resigned myself to the idea that, despite all this, the business would be mine. After all, this was what they had trained me for. This was what I lived for, with the feeling that every day brought me closer to my goal. Everything changed suddenly when I returned from a business trip to New York, where I had signed contracts with major suppliers, and learned that my parents had transferred all the documents and shares to my brother. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake, that the notary had mixed something up, but when I saw the papers and the signatures, it became clear. The decision was final. They said they wanted to give their youngest son a chance, that he had to prove himself, and that now I had to wait my turn, although the concept of turn had never existed in this business. I was shocked. It felt like my whole world had collapsed. I tried to talk to my parents, explaining that I'd been preparing all this time, that I could run the company better, that my brother would simply destroy what had taken decades to build. But their gaze was hard and cold, repeating that it was their decision, that they were sure my brother would have a great future, and that I should accept it. Something inside me snapped. I realized that now the only way to get my way was to act. Revenge became not just a desire, but a necessity, otherwise I would lose everything I lived for. I began to observe my brother, his habits, his friends, his financial decisions. He spent money recklessly, entered into questionable contracts, almost immediately signed leases for huge properties that I knew were unprofitable. I began looking for ways to use his irresponsibility against him. First, I carefully collected evidence that some deals were fraudulent, that he signed contracts without the approval of lawyers and financial advisors, creating legal and financial loopholes that could later be exploited. At the same time, I began building a network of allies within the company, people who had worked with us for decades and seen who was really keeping the business afloat. They didn't immediately believe my words, but when I showed them specific figures, contracts, and violations, they quietly began to agree with me. I understood that a direct confrontation with my brother and parents would achieve nothing, since he officially held everything in his hands, and any pressure would look like aggression on my part, not objective errors. So I chose a slow but precise strategy, where every step would be calculated. First, I began to strengthen my position among the finance department and key facility managers. I didn't immediately reveal my intentions, simply building a reputation as a competent and reliable leader who knew how to save the company from mistakes, but did so unobtrusively. Gradually, people began to listen to me, and my brother began calling more and more often with questions, demonstrating his lack of understanding of the business. I nudged him toward his own mistakes, gently advising him on quick fixes or lucrative deals that I knew would lead to losses or legal problems. He was so trusting that he never suspected I was doing everything intentionally. At the same time, I brought in a lawyer I'd worked with for a long time on the company's side, and we began reviewing the property transfer documents. We found several small but significant flaws in the transfer of rights that could have served as grounds for challenging the transaction. All of this required time and careful coordination. I couldn't act rashly, lest my parents notice someone was manipulating their decisions. My plan was to create a chain of events whereby my brother would put the company in a difficult position. Employees and partners would begin to lose trust in him, and legal loopholes would provide legitimate grounds for challenging the transfer. Deep down, I felt a strange combination of anger and delight. Anger at my parents for betraying me, at my brother for being irresponsible, and delight at how subtly you can manipulate events when you know people's weaknesses. This wasn't just revenge for the sake of revenge. It was revenge, deliberate and calculated, designed to restore justice in my eyes. Every day, I checked reports, studied new contracts, gently steered my brother's decisions in the right direction, gradually turning his mistakes into evidence of his inability to manage the business. I watched as employees began to discuss how things were going worse without me, as partners began calling me instead of him for advice, as my brother's mistakes began to appear in the reports I carefully documented. My strategy was nearly perfect, but it required patience. Any abrupt move could destroy everything I had built over the years, so I patiently observed, adjusted my actions, directed events, and every day I felt my power returning to me. I began to act almost immediately, but cautiously, understanding that any abrupt move would destroy everything I had built over the years. First, I continued to observe my brother, his habits and behavior within the company, recording every mistake, every rash decision. He entered into contracts without proper due diligence, signed leases for properties I knew would be unprofitable, and almost immediately created problems with suppliers and clients. I exploited this to my advantage, gently offering optimal solutions that looked like friendly advice, but in reality pushed him to even greater mistakes. At the same time, I began to strengthen my position among the employees I'd worked with since his teenage years. I pretended to be simply helping my brother avoid mistakes, but gradually, they began to understand who was really keeping the business afloat. I held meetings with managers, explained the property development strategy, pointed out weaknesses in the contracts, and soon the employees began to consult with me more than with him. Suppliers and partners began calling me for clarification, and my brother was forced to turn to me for advice, demonstrating his confusion. This gave me the opportunity to subtly guide his decisions in the right direction, creating a chain of errors that could be documented. At the same time, I began working in depth with a lawyer who had always assisted us with corporate matters. We found several legal flaws in the share transfer documents, wording that could be interpreted ambiguously, and errors in the signatures of some documents. This gave us potential grounds to challenge the business transfer in court if all the evidence of his incompetence was collected. I carefully shaped this evidence through my brother's actual actions, creating a legally binding picture of his inability to manage the company. My strategy was based on a combination of psychological pressure and objective facts. I maintained the outward appearance of cooperation, sometimes even praising his decisions in front of employees and partners so that he wouldn't suspect my intentions. But behind the scenes, I was directing events so that errors accumulated. Every day, I reviewed financial reports, monitored new deals, and adjusted strategy. He signed some contracts hastily, without checking the terms, which led to losses and tense negotiations. I gently intervened, suggesting corrections, and these corrections were recorded in documents as his mistakes or as evidence of his inability to make independent decisions. Employees, initially skeptical, began to quietly agree with me, sharing observations about my brother's confusion at management, which decisions were jeopardizing the company, and how he needed support. Partners, who had an outside perspective, began to turn to me for recommendations, and it soon became clear that trust in my brother was waning, while trust in me was growing. This gave me the opportunity to increase my influence and carefully manipulate events. At the same time, I introduced economic traps. I proposed high-cost projects to my brother that appeared profitable at first glance, but had hidden risks. He signed the documents, and I documented the consequences, creating evidence of his incompetence. These actions simultaneously caused real damage to the company and created a legal basis for challenging the business transfer. My revenge was not emotional. It was cold and deliberate, every step calculated to maximize the outcome and minimize the risk of exposure. My parents still believed they had given my brother a chance, and didn't notice the subtle game I was playing because I carefully maintained the appearance of a peaceful relationship. With each passing day, I watched my brother lose confidence, make more and more mistakes, his employees increasingly ignore his advice, and his partners turn to me. I created an atmosphere in which his decisions appeared irresponsible, yet he formally remained the owner, giving us the opportunity to use evidence to launch a legal challenge at the right moment. This process required incredible patience. I analyzed reports daily, adjusted strategy, reviewed documents, and communicated with lawyers and employees to ensure no one would suspect my true intentions. My revenge wasn't instantaneous. It developed gradually, and I felt a strange satisfaction at how a carefully crafted strategy was working to restore justice. A sense of power and control filled me like I'd never experienced before, because I was finally in control of events that felt like they had been handed to me by my parents. I knew that every new contract, every mistake my brother made, every recommendation from an employee brought me closer to the moment when I could officially reclaim the business. I continued to document all of my brother's mistakes and weaknesses, creating comprehensive documentation that could prove decisive in court. At the same time, I strengthened my position in the company, building a trusted network of allies and confidence among my partners that I, not my brother, was the reliable leader. My revenge slowly but surely unfolded, transforming from an emotional reaction into a carefully planned strategy, where every element was part of a master plan to restore what was rightfully mine. I watched as the business began to crumble under the pressure of his poor decisions, while employees and partners began to rely on me instead of him. I watched as my brother's trust waned, his confidence waned, and my position strengthened. Everything was going according to plan, and I felt a strange combination of anger, satisfaction, and anticipation of the moment, when the law and circumstances would finally return to me what had been mine from the very beginning. Every day, I acted cautiously but decisively, turning my knowledge, experience, and strategy into an invisible weapon of revenge that gradually, step by step, restored justice in my life. After months of careful observation and systematic work, I felt I could take more decisive steps. My successes among employees and partners began to attract the attention of a long-standing family partner, a man who had invested in our business from the very beginning and trusted my parents. He observed the situation from a distance, saw that my brother was performing worse than expected, and began looking for ways to support the company without directly interfering in family affairs. I approached him with a proposal to discuss the situation honestly and openly, showing him concrete results, reports on losses due to my brother's rash decisions, amended contracts, improved performance at key sites, employee comments on who was really keeping the company afloat. He appreciated my transparency and problem-solving skills and realized that I was ready to take responsibility. We agreed that he would support my initiatives financially and organizationally, maintaining the appearance that my brother remained the official owner while we worked together to rebuild trust and correct mistakes. Employees, I trusted, now received confirmation of my competence from him, which strengthened their confidence in my decisions and made my influence officially visible but unobtrusive. During this time, I continued to gently guide my brother so that his mistakes remained obvious to everyone, but not so catastrophic as to cause direct conflict.
He was beginning to lose confidence and began consulting with me more often, which allowed me to monitor progress and document evidence of his inability to manage without constant support. Gradually, I began proposing larger projects and initiatives that allowed me to demonstrate tangible results, increasing the profitability of properties, reducing unnecessary expenses, improving relationships with partners. All of this seemed natural and convincing to my parents, who had begun to notice my successes but had not yet directly intervened, believing that my brother was getting his chance. My partner and I developed a plan whereby any questionable decisions my brother made would be automatically corrected by me, with minimal outside interference. At the same time, we began carefully preparing legal documents confirming my accomplishments and proving my brother's incompetence, so that if necessary, we could formally redistribute control without conflict. Within a few weeks, my role in the company had become virtually pivotal. Employees followed my instructions, partners consulted with me, and financial performance began to improve. My brother seemed increasingly confused, his advice was ignored, and this allowed for the illusion that everything was under control, but at the same time I was in control. My parents began to notice that under my leadership, things were improving, indicators were growing, partners were happy, and employees were working together smoothly. I began to gently discuss with them a possible redistribution of authority, showing specific figures and improvements, not focusing on my brother's mistakes, but emphasizing the positive results of my actions. My family partner provided support in the form of recommendations, small investments to stabilize complex assets, and strategic management advice, which allowed me to act with greater confidence and without risking my reputation. A situation gradually developed within the company where, despite my brother's formal ownership, actual control was transferred to me. I continued to document all actions, improved indicators, corrected errors, the results of initiatives, so that, if necessary, this would serve as the legal and factual basis for finally regaining control. My brother, although the official owner, increasingly felt my influence, heeding my advice, and his independent decisions led to small but noticeable miscalculations, which strengthened my position and the employees' perception of who was truly running the company. My parents saw progress and began to trust me more than him, although they still tried to maintain neutrality. I felt that every day brought me closer to the moment when the official reassertion of control would become natural and conflict-free. My revenge, initially emotional and aimed at restoring justice, evolved into a realistic, well-thought-out strategy, a combination of personal influence, business expertise, legal training, and the support of a reliable partner. I was no longer simply correcting my brother's mistakes. I was carefully constructing a new management structure that felt natural to everyone involved, while at the same time fully returning to me what had been intended for me from the very beginning. Every step, every initiative, every small victory strengthened my position, built trust, and demonstrated my ability to lead the company forward. Although my brother still remained the formal owner, his influence gradually diminished, while my actual capabilities and authority grew with each passing day. I felt a sense of satisfaction and calm within me. My revenge wasn't loud or destructive, it was precise, slow, and effective. I understood that only the formal legal formalization of the redistribution of control lay ahead, but thanks to a consistent strategy, the support of my partner, and the strengthening of the trust of my employees and parents, this moment would be the natural conclusion of a long struggle for what was rightfully mine. Every day I saw the results of my work. The business stabilized, revenue grew, employees and partners trusted me, and my brother lost confidence and gradually faded into the background. All of this was realistic, logical, and most importantly, consistent with my original motivation, to reclaim the family legacy that should have been mine from the start, without damaging my relationship with my parents or creating a public conflict, using only my knowledge, skills, and strategic thinking. I knew the time had come to show everyone who truly owned the company and who was capable of managing it effectively. After months of careful work, observing my brother, and gradually strengthening my influence among employees and partners, I realized I could move more openly. Together with my partner, we developed a plan to publicly showcase my achievements. I gathered my parents, key employees, and partners for a formal meeting, prepared a detailed presentation, graphs, reports, and specific examples of projects I'd successfully corrected and improved after my brother's mistakes. When the meeting began, I began with financial indicators, revenue growth, cost reduction, improved relationships with partners and suppliers, stabilization of facility operations, and increased employee motivation. Everything was presented so that everyone could see the real results of my work, not just pretty numbers. I smoothly transitioned to the contracts my brother had signed without proper verification, demonstrating the consequences of these mistakes and how I had corrected them without directly accusing him, but emphasizing the preservation and development of the family legacy. At first, my brother tried to remain calm, listening and interrupting several times with pointed questions, but the further I progressed through the presentation, the more irritated he became. He began loudly interrupting me, claiming I was casting him in an unfavorable light, shouting that it was betrayal and attempting to discredit the figures and facts. But my evidence was accurate, and the employees quietly confirmed my findings, creating a sense of consensus. My parents watched the scene silently, obviously struck by his emotional reaction, and although they remained neutral, it was becoming clear they were beginning to notice who was really running the company. My brother stood up, swore, tried to block the presentation, shouted, and accused me of meanness, betraying the family and abusing their trust. But the more anger he expressed, the more obvious his impotence became. He was losing support among his employees and partners, who gradually agreed with me and confirmed the facts. I didn't respond to his shouting directly. I calmly showed him graphs, reports, and specific projects, capturing every moment, every emotion, every outburst in notes and documents for later discussions with his parents and legal advisors, if necessary. Partners and employees began to actively support me, sharing their observations of how my brother had made mistakes, how long it took to correct his decisions, and how positive changes had only occurred thanks to my initiatives. My brother's emotions grew. He became furious, waved his arms, and tried to interrupt me on every slide. But this only emphasized the gap between his formal authority and his actual inability to manage the company. At one point, he stood up and announced that he intended to contact lawyers, block decisions, and even demand an external audit. But my presentation was so compelling that the employees and partners supported me, demonstrating that I already had trust and influence. I carefully concluded the presentation, emphasizing my achievements and improvements, but leaving open the possibility of further discussion of the company's governance structure. This was done intentionally, so that the culmination of the revenge was visible, but the final distribution of power had not yet occurred. My parents, clearly impressed by what they had seen, began to ponder their next move. My brother, meanwhile, looked simultaneously defeated and indignant, his face flushed, his hands trembling, and his voice breaking as he tried to articulate his accusations and threats. He clearly felt he was losing control, and every bit of support from his employees and partners only deepened his sense of defeat. I saw everyone around me weighing facts rather than my brother's emotions, and I realized that the scene he'd created had worked to my advantage. His rage and public display of impotence made my position persuasive to everyone involved. After the presentation, we began discussing next steps. I proposed temporarily increasing my influence while maintaining my brother's formal stake, gradually introducing an external manager under my control, and documenting all decisions in documents that would legally protect the company and my role. My parents were hesitant, but they made it clear that my efforts and results had not gone unnoticed. My brother, however, continued to rant and rave, attempting to argue and threaten, but his words were having less and less impact on everyone else. At that moment, I felt a strange combination of satisfaction and tension. Revenge had reached its climax, my brother had been publicly defeated, my competence had been recognized by all the key people, but the final distribution of control was still to come. This created space for future confrontation, discussions with my parents, and emotional reflection, which would form the content of the final part of this story. I knew there would be a discussion with my parents about why they'd originally handed the business over to my brother, and that it would leave me feeling hurt and dissatisfied. But so far, everything had gone exactly as I'd planned. Publicly reveal who really owned the company, build pressure on my brother, strengthen the trust of my employees and partners, and pave the way for a final decision. The scene was over. My brother sat there with obvious irritation and a sense of defeat. My parents looked at me with new respect. My employees and partners understood that leadership had passed to me, and I felt myself slowly but surely approaching final justice, saving the final emotional denouement, and summing up for the next part, where I could process my feelings, my disappointment in my parents, and finally assess what it had cost me to go through all this to reclaim what was rightfully mine. After everything that had happened at the last meeting, I was alone in my office, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to stop and reflect on everything I'd been through. The room was quiet, broken only by the gentle hum of the air conditioner and the occasional sounds from the street, but inside me, a tide of thoughts and emotions raged, simultaneously oppressive and liberating. At first, I simply sat motionless, recalling every step of the past few months. How I'd observed my brother, documented his mistakes, carefully guided the employees' decisions, and created situations in which his decisions appeared ineffective, but without direct conflict, so as not to damage either the employees' trust or my parents' impressions. I saw how my influence gradually strengthened, how people began to listen to me more than to my brother, and how a family partner, who had been observing all this from the sidelines, became my ally, providing support and confirming my competence to key shareholders and employees. This entire strategy had been carefully crafted. Every detail, every action, every document made sense and was aimed at creating a situation in which my victory would look not like violence, but like a logical, natural, and deserved outcome. I replayed that moment at the meeting, how I calmly presented graphs, reports, and projects I'd corrected after my brother's mistakes, how he tried to interrupt me, shout, and accuse me of betrayal and meanness, but the more intensely he expressed his emotions, the more obvious it became who really controlled the company. How the employees and partners gradually accepted my position, confirmed the data, and made it clear that they trusted me, not my brother. I remembered how my parents watched it all silently, trying to maintain neutrality, and how their gazes gradually began to acknowledge that I was indeed managing the company better than my brother. And along with that acknowledgement, bitterness emerged. I recalled again the years when they promised that the business would be mine, when I studied diligently, helped with the company, sacrificed my personal time and my own desires in order to be ready for this role. And then, in an instant, they rewrote everything for my brother, a man who often acted rashly, made mistakes, and was unprepared for responsibility. I felt a strange combination of triumph and resentment. On the surface, everything had worked out perfectly. I'd proven to everyone that I was capable of leadership, that I was trustworthy, that I could correct mistakes and stabilize the business. But internally, I was still bitter about my parents' decision, which I couldn't change. I opened the documents my partner and I had prepared. Financial growth charts, cost-cutting reports, employee and partner comments, amended contracts, detailed explanations of every improvement I'd made. All this gave me a sense of control and confidence, but at the same time I understood that the real victory wasn't in the paperwork, but in how I'd weathered all the trials, maintaining my composure, patience, and strategy. I thought again of my brother at the meeting. His anger, his attempts to interrupt me, his threats of legal action, his attempts to discredit me in the eyes of my parents and employees. His anger was almost palpable, and I realized it only underscored my position. He was losing control, and I was strengthening it without raising my voice or making any sudden moves, simply presenting facts and results. A strange sense of satisfaction grew within me. Revenge had reached its climax, my plan had worked, my competence was obvious, and my brother remained the formal owner but without influence. But at the same time, an internal tension grew. I felt a deep resentment toward my parents for entrusting the business to him. Memories of childhood surfaced, of conversations when they told me the business would be mine, of all the efforts, sleepless nights, and sacrifices I had made to prepare for this role. And suddenly it all seemed like a game with double rules. Outwardly I had won, but inside I remained hurt, a sense of injustice and disappointment. I understood that their decision would not have changed even if they had seen how prepared I was and how incompetent my brother was. And this thought gave the ending a special heaviness. Revenge was complete, victory achieved, but personal feelings remained complex and ambiguous. I reflected on the future. The company was stable, employees and partners trusted me. My brother had realized his defeat, but my family remained complex. Old grievances and my parents' decisions would live alongside my successes. I understood that I would have to endure the internal struggle, accept it as part of my history. But at the same time, I felt proud that I had managed to overcome all of this, develop a strategy, execute my revenge, show everyone who was truly capable of leadership, and save the company. I closed the documents, looked out the window at the city, and allowed myself a deep breath. A slight fatigue, a mixture of satisfaction and bitterness, tension that had not yet subsided, but now the feeling of power and control was clear. I understood that the lessons I had learned from this story, not only about business, revenge, and management, but also about family, trust, resentment, and inner justice, would stay with me forever. I smiled, bitterly but proudly, realizing that the revenge had been perfectly executed, yet left room for reflection and emotion, which makes the ending fulfilling, vivid, and believable. And in this combination of victory and internal struggle, triumph over my brother and resentment toward my parents, I understood the most important thing. True revenge is not simply an outward triumph and the restoration of justice, but the ability to endure all trials, maintain composure, think strategically, demonstrate competence, and at the same time remain a person who senses and understands the complexity of human relationships, the power of emotions, and the gravity of decisions made by others that have shaped your entire life. I sat in a chair, looked out over the evening city, and for the first time allowed myself to feel a full, albeit complex, sense of completion. The company was in my hands, My brother had been defeated, my partner trusted me, my employees were confident, my parents recognized my accomplishments, but personal pain and resentment remained, making the ending emotionally rich, vivid, and intriguing, because a true story isn't just about victory, but also about everything that happens inside the person who experienced it. I knew that long reflections on family, justice, and personal relationships lay ahead, but I was ready to face this stage, because now I knew for sure. Everything I had done was deserved, deliberate, legal, strategically, and emotionally fully justified, and the story of my revenge became not only proof of my strength, but also a profound personal victory that shaped me as a leader, as a person, and as a family member who had endured injustice and managed to turn it to my advantage, while maintaining honor, respect, and control.